This is the heart of a sleeping country, Mexico. It was a city built long before Christ. It was bigger than the Rome of Julius Caesar. It was the world's first metropolis, a New York of pyramids and apartment blocks, of spacious parks and six-lane highways, such as this, the Street of the Dead. At the high noon of its civilization, it was abandoned. No one knew who its people were, where they had come from, where they went, or why. The Aztec Indians discovered it, declared it their capital, and named the pyramids after the sun and the moon. Then the Spanish came, and after much trickery and bloodshed, the two races merged. Passiveness with aggression, a sense of betrayal with triumph. They had nothing in common, except a fanatical devotion to religion. The Aztecs believed in sacrificing human hearts to their god. The Spanish aspired to eat the blood and flesh of their god. Together they became a unique nation, the Mexicans. That, of course, is an outrageous abbreviation of history, as only a journalist will attempt. But even an hour-long documentary such as this can't evade the past. For there are few countries as traumatized by their past as Mexico, and there is no nation approaching its second high noon as fast as Mexico. This is an opportunity, said the Mexican President Lopez Portillo the other day, that comes only once in history. He was referring to oil. Mexico, dominated and scorned for so long by its all-powerful neighbor, will in a decade be the greatest oil producer on earth, greater than America, greater than Russia, greater than all the sheikhs put together. The pauper, south of the border, has literally won the pools. And with all due respect to events in Africa and the Middle East, the change of fortunes of a country so long in the shadows is sensational and likely to change the world.
Para pelear, Balahu siendo guerrero, le dijo a su compañera, vámonos a navegar, a ver quién sale primero, al otro lado del mar. Ariles y más ariles, ariles, vengo diciendo, ábreme la puerta, cielo, quítame de andar sufriendo. Ariles y más ariles, ariles del carrizal, me picaron las arripas, pero me comí el parlar.
Mexico's greatest poet, Octavio Paz, wrote, "The history of Mexico is the history of a man seeking his parentage, his origins." In this famous mural in the National Palace, painted by Diego Rivera, all the agony of Mexico's introspection is seen in tragedy and betrayal. When the Spanish conquistadores came in the 16th century, people were subjugated to the warrior Aztecs. And yet Hernan Cortés, the father of modern Mexico, is today portrayed as a sadistic idiot and reviled for having conquered the Aztecs. After Spain had bled Mexico of its wealth, the United States invaded in 1847 and took half of Mexico's territory. In 1862, the French intervened and installed the melancholy figure of Maximilian as emperor until he was betrayed and murdered. The liberal reform government of Benito Juarez offered small hopes, but it was betrayed by Porfirio Diaz, whose dictatorship became a new dark age and finally gave way in 1910 to one of the bloodiest revolutions in history. Mexico's revolution was a cycle of coups and betrayals that lasted 10 years. It threw up warlords like Pancho Villa, that extraordinary Robin Hood come bandit, seen here shortly after he'd led his army on the only foreign invasion of the United States in revenge for American occupation of the port of Veracruz. In the beginning, the revolution was about land. In Morelos, one of the richest states, 17 families owned the great haciendas and the sugar mills, and those Indians and mixed-blood mestizos who resisted their authority were killed or deported or sold as slaves in the jungles of the Yucatan. Here a mestiza peasant called Emiliano Zapata grew up to be an expert horseman. A contemporary wrote of Zapata, "He was a quiet man with sad eyes, and his heart was consumed by the injustices around him." Viva Zapata, land and liberty, became the cry of the people of Morelos. And by 1911, the state belonged to Zapata and his followers, who produced what was perhaps the only social testament of the revolution, declaring all land to be the property of the state and establishing maximum sizes for farms depending on the quality of land. There were three main revolutionary groups, those led by Zapata and Pancho Villa, and by the so-called moderates, Carranza and Obregon. Only once and briefly were they united. They agreed to meet in Mexico City for a political convention. But when Zapata's principles were adopted by the convention, the moderates walked out, leaving the city to the armies of Villa and Zapata, who had never met before. The two men ate together and posed for these pictures. Then Zapata withdrew, leaving Villa to rule briefly until his troops were decimated by the Federal Army of Obregon. In Morelos, the very success of Zapata's revolution remained as a threat to the authoritarian reformers and the oligarchies that had grown up in the cities. In 1918, they turned their greater guns against Zapata land, scorching its earth. And on April the 10th, 1919, a trap was laid for Zapata himself. In one of the great haciendas, he was invited to talk peace with a colonel of the Federal Army. And as he rode through the gates, he died in a hail of bullets. Almost 2 million people died in the revolution, including all its greatest names. But none were idealists like Zapata, and as if to cover the enormity of the defeat of his dream, the generals and assorted despots who took over Mexico aggrandized and romanticized him in shrines such as this, in hundreds of statues, and they wrote his name in gold in the Mexican Congress. But it's not so much his memory as his betrayal that lives on here in Morelos, Zapata land. Just the other week, his dying son, Nicolas Zapata, said, "The revolution, it was balls." Some would say that's too harsh a judgment. The big haciendas were broken up, but people were given nothing to work the land with, and today are in peonage to creditors and banks and big families who own many small plots, as well as control much of Mexican industry. Today, Mexico is run by a monolith called the Party of the Institutionalized Revolution, a contradiction in terms if there ever was one. It has won every election for the past half-century, which is no wonder, as the opposition is allowed only 5% of seats. But Mexico has remained relatively stable. A leading journalist, Enrique Massa, talks about the unique system of patronage that gives each president dictatorial powers, then retires him after 6 years.
Authority is always sacred. That's why it has been possible to make some sort of a presidential system in Mexico. The president is always sacred. He's some sort of a god. In the presidential campaigns, the president goes out to the country, and the people ask him for favors. Do this and do that for me, and give us water, and give us housing, and give us food. He's some sort of a god, coming down with gifts to the people. This sacred authority has killed politics in Mexico. Not only that, corruption and control. The people are not aware of politics. It's a very depoliticized country.
Writers like D.H. Lawrence and Graham Greene have struggled to reach through the mask and secrecy of the Mexican character. Unlike any other nation, the Mexicans are a unique blend of the Spanish who came with Cortez and of the Indians who came from the Orient. Behind the Latin mask, there is great conflict, servility and violence, studied formality and chaos, and a patience that has endured for half a century. Land reform, the cry of the revolution, has failed. Mexico, itself chronically short of food, grows cash crops almost exclusively for the dinner tables of America. In the strawberry fields, children as young as 6 are put to work, openly and illegally. Mexico City is now the world's largest center of extreme wealth and extreme poverty, and by the end of the century, it may have a population of 40 millions. As the oil begins to flow, expectations have begun to rise, while half the nation remains effectively without work. This is called a lost city. 4 million people live in shanty towns like this, without running water or sewerage. They have drifted from the countryside and are camped at the city's gates like a silent army, waiting. They are known as pepenadores, literally people who live off rubbish. And yet, in spite of their wretchedness, they somehow manage to keep their hovels clean and their children neat, and their courtesies unrelenting to well-shod foreigners, such as our film crew as we intruded on them. By noon, the morning sun will have been replaced by an opaque screen of fumes and filth. By mid-afternoon, the dust will arrive from the empty bowl of Lake Texcoco, gathering the seeds of hepatitis as it sweeps across the rubbish tips of the lost cities. The dust will be an irritant in the smartest hotels and restaurants, where foreign businessmen will, like everyone, have the red-eyed look of permanent grief as they praise what they call Mexico's development and rate of growth. One reason why land reform has failed and the cities are bursting is that there are simply too many people. Incredibly, the last president of Mexico, Luis Echeverria, regarded birth control as a scheme to undermine the third world. Marta Lamas, a campaigner for women's rights, explains.
It was a way of seeing politically that Mexico belongs to the third world, and what the third world needs now, it's more population for him.
A radical view.
Yes, a radical future. And it was until his fifth year of mandate here that he began to change the policy of demographic control. And they have doing it very slowly, and I think that that's not the way out of the problems we have in Mexico. Every ministry has a program that includes birth control. The Ministry of Education, of Agriculture, the of Health, they have special programs. Even the Department of Fishery has a program that includes...
Department of Fisheries?
Yes, with the women of the fishermen. Everybody's very interested. Now, I see a contradiction between this birth control programs the government is trying to do, and at the same time, the restriction they have on abortion laws. In Mexico, the only way to have an abortion is if you have been raped, and if you have gone and given testimony before a judge, and afterwards you see you are pregnant, then you have the legal right to have an abortion, but only because of that, not even because of genetic malfunctions or with problems that a doctor can say that the baby is going to be blind or with a genetic disorder. So we see a contradiction. What we are in Mexico, the women trying to get the government to approve is what we call voluntary maternity, that we have the kids we want to have, but only the kids we want to have.
The present government of Lopez Portillo has mounted one of the most successful attempts at birth control in the third world, with the result that some 40% of all women of childbearing age have been persuaded to use contraception. This is all the more remarkable as Mexico is one of the most fundamentalist Catholic countries in the world. Under the law, Pope John Paul could have been fined for holding an open-air mass in Mexico last year. For the church is still remembered in Mexico for its extreme wealth and power and inquisitional cruelty. Relations with the Vatican were broken off 120 years ago and have never been restored. A priest or a nun who wears a clerical habit in public is breaking the law, and all churches are property of the state. But here again, this is all part of the mask of Mexico. Under our Constitution, a priest told me, his voice heavy with irony, "I am an outcast of the state." As he spoke, women came from their houses, dropped to their knees, and whispered, "Padre." "Forgive them," said the priest. "These simple people have not read the Constitution."
Oh, Father Salinas, good to see you.
Orphanages such as this one are common in Mexico. This is not to say that the poorest Mexicans easily give up their children. They are by instinct family people and deeply caring. They simply cannot support their children in a society whose national riches flow automatically to the top. This year, Mexico's growth rate will exceed 10%, thanks to oil. It will not include these children.
Oh, here he is. What's his name? I've forgotten.
It's Ismael.
Ismael.
His mother was an alcoholic. The father is an old man. He's about 65. He disappeared. The mother, they had to intern her in an alcoholic hospital. They don't know for how long. They have to intern her. These boys' father killed the mother, and this boy saw it. And after that, the father died. The older brother lived with an aunt, so he had a little more education. But the little boy, this little boy, has never been to one day of schooling. He doesn't know how to read, doesn't know how to write.
He's still very affected by...
Oh, very much.
By
Very much. And he
seeing his mother
fights.
killed.
Yeah, I think that affected him as a little. And he fights continuously. I mean, he should be a boxer because he's always fighting with all of them.
For these children, the priest and his small rented house are the difference between a semblance of a childhood and a life of street beggary. To pay the rent, the priest himself discreetly begs donations from tourists. At the time of our filming, his orphanage was to close because the landlord wanted to sell and he lacked the money.
Well, the majority of your Mexican children are undernourished. I mean, they need more vitamins. I mean, they have this, that as long as they give them beans and tortillas, the children will be happy, but it isn't that. Children need more than beans and tortillas.
A government official says, "The political system of Mexico is truly revolutionary. It is not ideological. It can accommodate left-wingers and right-wingers, whose only point in common is some self-interest in seeing the system survive. And those who prosper by the system must make one important concession to the poorer classes. They must be discreet."
We have a new addition of a baby whose parents are having problems.
That's the baby of one
That's
of
a
your
baby of
former-
one of my former boys. Yesterday, he brought his things, and he left all the things he had, and he stayed on the street. I mean, I don't know where they were just sitting around, but it got cold, and at 5 o'clock in the morning, he just knocked on the door and left the baby all wrapped up in coats and everything. When I got up, I saw his things there, and I said, did Miguel Angel leave his things here? They said, yes, and he also left the baby. I said, who's the baby? I said, the baby's right here. I told Patricia, I said, you're going to take care of the baby. You take care of him, you're a little older. He said, I'm going to change him, but I'm not going to wash his diapers. Anyone that has children, as a father, thinks the same. I mean, he wants the best for his children. We don't know the future. We hope to train them so that these boys will have something. Our lema, as you say right here, it says, today, an abandoned child. Tomorrow, he is a man of success.
The latest estimate of Mexico's possible oil reserves is 300,000 million barrels, almost twice that of Saudi Arabia. Noting events in the Middle East, the Mexican government has shrewdly decided to hold back production for the time being. If and when it changes its mind, Mexico could transform the world's oil supply overnight and upset the global power game. President Carter has been told by his experts that a 40-year pool of oil for energy-ravenous America lies just south of the border. The very mention of oil stirs the deepest emotions in Mexico. In 1938, the international oil companies were nationalized for refusing to pay more than starvation wages. The United States immediately encouraged a boycott of Mexican crude oil, forcing the Mexicans to sell to Hitler and Mussolini. Britain, in a burst of imperial temper, broke off relations, and even now the British tread warily in a country where the past is the present. Courted and cultivated by presidents and kings, Mexico's politicians are enjoying the sensation of dispensing patronage to those who 5 years ago would not have given them the time of day. Moreover, the state oil monopoly, Pemex, has proved to foreign skeptics that it has the expertise and capability to keep the oil flowing. From Carter to Castro, they come with a deference that only the pursuit of oil inspires. Last year, President Carter came to Mexico to court the despised wetbacks, the American derisory term for Mexicans. Unfortunately, at a state dinner, he informed the Mexican nation of the esteem in which America held them. He announced that he'd caught Montezuma's revenge, the American tourist slang for diarrhea.
Oil is going to subsidize again national and foreign investment and create a little satisfaction of the popular demands in order to create an internal market.
Will this create enough advantage amongst a minority, or will people look at the riches that are flowing in their own country?
No, I don't think it will flow to the people. I think it will flow to a minority and make this minority even more rich and wealthy. And the people will have something of that, of course. You cannot sit on a volcano. You have to satisfy the people somehow.
How will corruption affect the production, distribution, and the advantages of oil?
The same way it has always worked. That's why I'm not too hopeful about oil in Mexico. We could be very rich if we decided to export the technology of corruption. We have made corruption such a smooth working. It's a way of life. It's not just something that is wrong. It's a way of life. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of doing business. It's our own way of living. You know...
Give me some examples there.
For instance, it begins with religion. You never ask God to give you something if you don't give in advance. So I give you, so you give me. And this is a trade. So when I cross a red light, for instance, in the middle of the street, the policeman stops me and says, "Listen, man, you cross a red light." And I said, "Yeah, I did." So I give him something, and he gives me back my own documents. So it's a mutual giving. Corruption has gone so deep in our souls that I don't see how oil is going to change that. I mean, unemployment is 58%, and the government has to create jobs. So some part of this money, oil money, will go to the creation of jobs. That's for sure. But I think it will be a small part, not the great part of that money which is going to flow to the rich.
This is Southern California. It was once Mexico, It was taken from the Mexicans at the end of one of the most rapacious wars in history, begun by the American settlers in order to fill the great bowl of the West. Between 1836 and 1848, the settlers sliced Mexico in half and took enough land to create 6 new states. Today, millions of Mexicans cross this border, a mere flimsy fence, looking for work. They are very poor and sometimes courageous people, and whole communities depend on the wages they send home. They are called wetbacks because many of them try to swim the Rio Grande in Texas. Here they are called pollos, chickens, and they are preyed upon by other Mexicans called coyotes, people smugglers, who extort their last dollar.
Yeah, you go out to that van, it's loaded. Yeah, Bill, I got him in the, he's in this complex between Hollis and 27th and Tocayo. I'm almost positive he's going to be good. 1026 on a white Ford van. I'm on Coronado in front of the South Big Drive-In.
This is the U.S. Border Patrol base at Chula Vista, a memory of Vietnam. The computers are plugged into an electronic battlefield of tiny unseen sensors that pick up human footsteps and sneezes and farts, and were originally designed to catch the elusive Viet Cong, and are equally useless here. This year, at least 4 million Mexicans will get safely across the border and melt into America, a prospect welcomed by the Mexican government as an insurance against the second overdue revolution. As if conceding the farce of it all, the United States Attorney General announced last year, "We are going to build a new fence. It will be more attractive and more effective without presenting a danger to anyone trying to scale it." Larry Hall, like many of the Border Patrolmen, is a veteran of Vietnam. Larry has a fine sense of irony. "I ask you," he says, "where else on God's earth can a man wear a big hat, tote a 6-gun, and play cowboys and Indians without nobody getting zapped?"
We'll probably catch between 600 and 1,000.
600 and 1,000.
Somewhere between there tonight. Well, the full 24-hour day, starting yesterday at midnight. We probably apprehend somewhere between 8 to 12% of what actually crosses. Most generally, we try to send them back to Mexico at least before the next meal. Sometimes we have to hold them for a while because our processing backs up. And if at all possible, we like to hold them for the shift so we won't have to catch them twice in the same evening.
It's like a flood every day, isn't it, of people just in your area. So really what you're doing is just keeping a finger in the dike.
We're much like the little Dutch boy.
Do you form an affinity with these people? I mean, how do you personally feel about them?
Well, I have no antipathy, if that's what you mean. I'm just out to do what I'm paid to do, which is apprehend them.
Yeah.
But as far as personal feelings, I have compassion. I think that if the situation were reversed, there's not a patrol agent in the Border Patrol who wouldn't say he might be doing the same thing.
I mean, these people are coming to the United States for work, for jobs, and that's boils down to that.
It's an economic question.
Yeah.
Most of these people are perfectly willing to give an honest day's work for $1.
441 area. Okay, 10 free hours. I'm coming up 117. I'm just hitting the freeway sign right now. Yeah, I don't know if they made it across. 827-337. How long off is your last 441?
This is a quiet night. The night before, the freeway traffic had to stop while the human traffic crossed. "Don't worry, fellas," says Larry. "You'll make it next time." Where did they come from?
Okay, they came from right over the freeway here by this telephone pole.
Wait, that's Mexico just over there?
No, Mexico's about 4.5 miles that way. These guys have walked about probably 8 or 9 miles
so far tonight. They probably crossed, about 4 miles to our east, and then about 3 or 4 miles south. That's where they came from.
Did you ask them where they were headed?
¿Dónde iban? ¿Dónde iban?
Los Ángeles, ¿por qué vamos a echar mentiras?
They were all headed for Los Angeles.
What kind of work were they looking for there? Could you ask them that?
Sí, ¿qué clase? ¿Qué clase?
Coliflor y eso.
¿Mande?
El coliflor y eso.
Los campos? Field work or work in a factory, whatever they could find. They're all from state and central Mexico, Cosowayo. Generally, they'll join together in groups for protection from the banditos and the other people that prey primarily on the illegal.
Now, some of us are illegal and others not wanted. Our work contract's out and we have to move on. 600 miles to the Mexico border. They chase us like outlaws, like rustlers and thieves. We died in your hills and we've died on your deserts. We've died in your valleys, we've died on your plains. We've died in your trees and we've died in your bushes. Both sides of the river, we've died just the same. Goodbye to my one, goodbye, Rosalita. Adios, mi amigos, Jesus y Maria. You won't have a name when you ride the big airplane, and all that will call you will be deportees.
Hundreds don't make it. On this freeway is the bloodstain of a woman, just a few feet from the good life. In Laredo, Texas, 24 bodies are washed up from the Rio Grande. In the Arizona desert, the bodies of an old man and a boy are found, the prey of bandits. But such is their need for work, simply to survive, that they keep on coming. And for every one that Larry catches, 5 make it across. Once across the border, the Mexicans are sold the birth certificates of dead Americans, or they're led straight to fruit-picking gangs, or to the sweatshops of Los Angeles. Some smugglers are contracted by American farmers to supply up to 50 workers for the cotton harvest in Georgia, a modern form of slavery. The farmer takes the smuggler's fee out of the Mexicans' wages, which often means that they work 5 or 6 weeks for nothing. The farmer may then sell his Mexicans to another farmer, and his commission is deducted from their wages. The Mexicans can't complain because they're illegal, and they can't go home because they have no money. But they keep on coming as yet another expression of the grandiose and accepted tragedy of Mexico's past and present.
We have been exploited, we have been amputated. Our territory was taken away. I mean, they even have half of our country. They took away half of our country. New Mexico and Texas and California and Arizona, all that was ours.
Do Mexicans still feel that
Yes,
their country was
very
cut
much.
in half?
Yes, very much. Externally, we hate the United States. Internally, we know that the United States will solve our problems with their money. And we are always asking for them to solve our problems. Say, for instance, this problem of the immigrants to the United States. It's an internal problem. I mean, it's our problem. We don't create jobs. So the people have to go out, to go to the United States to get a job there. But it's our problem to solve that.
The old lament says, "Poor Mexico, so far from God, so near to the United States." This is Tijuana, just over the California border. You drive down glittering Highway 5 from Los Angeles, past the movie studios, the great aerospace industries, Disneyland, the millionaire country clubs, and Richard Nixon's hideout. Then suddenly all these modern wonders disappear as you cross the border and there are potholes and open sewers and begging children and other tourists. Hey presto, you have left the most developed nation on earth and you're in what they call a developing nation, which means, of course, that here objects and not people are being developed. And because Mexico is so close to the United States, which sets the pattern and scale of expectations, the fate of the majority, who are not beneficiaries of the system, seems infinitely worse. Tijuana and the nearby spa of Agua Caliente have been oases for tired Americans since Prohibition times. And the big names of Hollywood, like Clark Gable and Gloria Swanson, came down to gamble at the casinos. Rita Hayworth learned to dance here. And Al Capone and the boys took refuge here. Today, it's rather a sad, tacky little place, with that great Mexican passion and sense of history, sublimated for a few bucks. But Mexicans, being Mexicans, retain their patience and humanity and their wry sense of humor. They call Tijuana Pozo del Mundo, brothel to the world, or rather brothel to America. With your dollars, you can come down in the morning and get laid multiracially, married, divorced, aborted, and be back in time for happy hour. Midwestern businessmen hold their conventions here, Rotarians their lunches. They never see where the people live, and most of the people live in hovels spilling down the hillside overlooking America. Some of them are employed in the 400 American factories that are allowed to operate on the Mexican side of the border as legal sweatshops. The workers are mostly young women who make 40 pence an hour or less. The raw materials are imported from America and the assembled product is sold back, duty-free. When President Carter came to Mexico, President Lopez Portillo told him, "We do not wish to view our history as one that anchors us to a burden of resentment, just as we would not like you to contemplate your future in terms of the risks of silent immigration." Was this a warning from behind the Mexican mask? Was he saying, you may have stolen half our land, but in retribution you will soon have 26 million Hispanic peoples, a minority greater than the blacks, and most of them young and angry. Today in Latin America, only Guatemala has a concentration of wealth greater than Mexico. It is a common sight. A limousine with darkened windows glides through the best suburbs, where the houses are like forts. Behind it are two other large cars, each sprouting radio antennae and with armed bodyguards impatiently waving cars and pedestrians aside. The coming of the urban guerrilla, the kidnapper, and the assassin has created a deep sense of insecurity among Mexico's elite, who even ask newspapers to keep their names and photographs off the social pages. Who are the elite? No longer the landed class, they are a group of brilliant entrepreneurs who have built their own banks and multinational companies. They have their city mansions, their country haciendas, and their villas in Acapulco, well away from the tourists, and of course, a discreet distance from the poverty. 30 of the biggest moguls belong to what is called the Businessmen's Council, which meets secretly with presidents and ministers, not to manipulate, but to shore up the system's illusion of power over 70 million people, among whom there is now the faintest stirring. A red Rolls-Royce, priced £56,000 plus seat belts and mink carpets, remains parked between the cherubic fountains and the columned portico of a mansion in Mexico City. To drive it outside past the closed-circuit TV and the electric gates would be indiscreet and perhaps even foolish. The owner is a member of the Businessmen's Council. You ask about oil, he says. Of course, it will bring great benefits to the ordinary people. In the state of Morelos, Zapata land, 15,000 peasants have occupied land in the name of a revolution of 2 generations ago. They have even fought the army and lost. Today the countryside is quiet. the people charming to an outsider. But the bitterness is like tinder. There is no firm evidence that it will ignite again. There is only, wrote D.H. Lawrence, a sound too deep for the ear to hear, and yet audible on the blood, a sound of dread.
The poverty of the people is really too hard, too hard. The whole system in Mexico is decaying, you know. It's a process of decay. And corruption is going so deep that it is becoming abjection. And this is what gives me hope that something is going to happen in Mexico. Because from abjection comes out revolution.
In 1968, at the time of the Mexico Olympics, the sons and daughters of the middle class tried revolution again, and it failed again. 300 of them were killed by the army, and today their leaders have been mostly absorbed into the great pyramid of Mexican patronage. Of course, dissident opinion is allowed in Mexico. Even the small Communist Party is legal. We were allowed to go and film wherever we wanted, to interview whomever we wanted. We all know the limits, said a writer. Opinions must be expressed to a small audience, in the least read sections of newspapers and literary magazines, and to harmless foreigners like yourself. A group of mothers trying to trace 460 disappeared persons, including their own sons, are led by this brave woman, Senora Rosario Ibarra de Piedra.
We have a list, a big list of 460 disappeared persons in Mexico. We say disappeared, but the real thing is they are kidnapped by the police or by paramilitary groups or by the army in Mexico, and they are taken to secret prisons, to clandestine jails, like the military camp number 1 here in Mexico City.
You became interested in these people because one of these disappeared persons is your own son.
Yes, yes, it's my son.
And that is your son.
This is my son, Jesus Piedra Ibarra. He was in a medical school. He was walking in the street and they took him away.
Was there any reason at all for your son to be taken away by the authorities?
Well, they say he was a member of a group called the Liga Comunista 23 de Septiembre. But if that was truth, it doesn't matter. They must take all the people who commit a crime, any crime, they must take them to a judge, and yes. They don't do that with dissidents.
This is how the army dealt with dissidents in 1968. Few were charged. Some were never heard of again.
What evidence do you have that people end up in military camps and in prisons?
Many prisoners who are in legal prisons, they were in the military camp number 1 during torture. They are tortured, all of them. And these men, so many of these...
Can I just stop you? What evidence do you have of torture?
Of torture, many. My husband is a doctor, 62 years old, and he was taken from his office because he was the father of a supuesto, presunto guerrillero, and he was tortured, and they broke his spine. To my husband, I know what torture means. I know everything. I can tell you everything.
Who broke his spine? This was at an army camp?
No, this was in the police.
What did they do to break his spine?
Well, they put his head in dirty water, and he was, how do you say, asphyxiándose?
Yes.
Well, and then they put, there was a very, very tall and strong man, and put his knee on his back.
In his back.
And make him like this and broke his spine.
And he's 62 years old?
Yes. He couldn't walk 5 months. He was very, very sick.
And this because his son was
yes, they
considered
wanted
to be a
guerrillero.
A guerrilla. Senor Piedra, this is a list of some of the disappeared people. Now, can you point out 1 or 2 and tell me about them?
Well, This was a past peasant from Guerrero.
His name is?
Is Ignacio Zamora Roman.
Yes.
He was in a bus in Guerrero, and the army went there. There was a man who, how do you say, pointed
yes.
him, and they took him away.
And was he a political activist of any kind?
No. The governor said he was a member from the guerrilla from Lucio Cabañas. This is not true. He is an old man.
Now, this man is an architect. Can you tell me something about him?
José Sayek Nevares. He was also kidnapped by the police, and now the Attorney General said he is dead, and the police said he was a member of the Liga Comunista 23 de Septiembre. We think this is not true.
Now, I see on one of these posters a baby. He must be about 2 years old. What is he doing amongst the list of disappeared?
Well, his parents, they sell fruit or anything in the streets in the city of Puebla. They have a group, how do you say, trade union.
Yes.
And his parents were the leaders of this trade union, and they wanted land for their homes. And the government didn't like that, and they disappeared the child to make them...
They took away the child?
Yes. They wanted...
From the parents?
From the parents. They wanted them to be quiet and not to say anything, and they took the child 2 years ago.
These last few years since your son disappeared must have been very difficult years for you and for all the other mothers.
For all the others. My case is, how do you say, a copy from all the others. All the others went like me after one... how do you say, funcionario, to a governor or the...
Yes, to all the officials.
To all the officials.
Do you sometimes get afraid? Are you sometimes afraid?
Well, yes.
Perhaps at the risk of sounding trite, I should say that all the people I met during the making of this film reflected a national open-heartedness and a quiet courage. At every turn, there seemed to be an act of generosity, a graciousness, and measured hope for the future. These are not abstractions, they are Mexico's real wealth. And it will be a tragedy if Mexico's leaders do not exploit the new material wealth of oil to reward this.
Is there something in this country at the moment that particularly strikes you as hopeful?
Yes, the nobleness of heart in the Mexicans. They are very, very noble, very generous, and they still have high ideals, particularly in the country, not so much in the city, but particularly in the country. And this gives me hope in the future of Mexico.
The eyes of all the world are in Mexico now because the oil, we know that. And they have, how do you say, an image of democracy,
yes.
democracy. And now we are going to make them, to clean this image if they really want to be, how do you say, prosperous with oil.
The work of the British writer D.H. Lawrence is much admired in Mexico, where people often speak their minds, not directly, but in stark images. Lawrence wrote a shrewd novel about Mexico called The Plumed Serpent. In it, one of the characters says this: Mexicans are like trees that the white men felled in their coming, but the roots of the trees are deep and alive, and each new shoot that comes up overthrows a Spanish church or an American factory. The roots and the life are there. What else is needed is the word for the forest to begin to rise again. Mexico is not just a faraway country, and what happens here may well affect us all. If you doubt this, you may recall events in other faraway countries in the Middle East that made us face our addiction to oil. Mexico is to become the most influential oil nation in the Western Hemisphere, perhaps in the world. But Mexico is not just a name to be neatly dropped into this or that strategic camp. Mexico is people, and the 10% growth rate that the economists say that the oil will bring is meaningless, while children work at the age of 6, while their parents have no work at all, while millions live beside open sewers, while people are kidnapped, for seeking their rights under the law. In the economist language, Mexico is a stable country, and so it is, for some. And how and when the rest of these extraordinary people determine their future is not known. But the roots and the life are there, as Lawrence wrote. And if the forest should rise again, it won't be just a faraway headache like Iran and Chile, for it'll happen just south of the border.